Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on Preston needs the Doughnut. And it's being organised by UCLAN's Institute of Citizenship, Society and Change. Before we go any further, can I just ask if people could make sure they're muted and turn their cameras off? That would be fantastic, apart from the speakers when they're speaking. We've got a very large audience, so I think in terms of keeping this smooth and running well, that's going to be the best way of making it function. Thanks, everyone. Okay, my name's Mark Doris, and I'm Professor in Health and Sustainability at the University of Central Lancashire, and I'm a co-director of the Institute of Citizenship, Society and Change. I'll be chairing and facilitating along with Professor Lynn Froggatt, who's a fellow co-director, and Dr. Mags Adams, who's our Institute coordinator. I want to start with a big thank you to Matthew, Kate and John, our three speakers and panelists. We're delighted that you've made the time to participate in today's event, which takes place in the midst of a pandemic that's raised questions about huge economic and social inequities in society, and in a week where the publication of the Doughnut review has highlighted the failure of economics to take account of the rapid depletion of the natural world and the need to find new measures of success to avoid a catastrophic breakdown. We're really excited to hear your presentations and dialogue as we all grapple with fundamental questions about the future of our communities and cities, about the type of world we want to build, about relationships between people, place and planet, and about the role of economics in responding to 21st century challenges. Before we get started, I want to thank Ethan Farrell and Larry Reynolds for their support leading up to this event, and to everyone who's here as a participant. There are just a few points I'd like to highlight. The event's being recorded so that we can make it widely available soon afterwards. As I said before, we'd be grateful if you could keep your microphones muted and your videos turned off, and hopefully the pinging of people arriving will stop quite soon. I'm sure Ethan can sort that. Please do use the chat function to make comments and ask questions relating to the presentations. As we've got, I think, more than 700 people registered for this, we will not be inviting participants to ask questions directly. Rather, the co-chairs will be harvesting questions posted and posing these to our speakers. The event will comprise 15-minute presentations from each the speakers, followed by a Q&A session and panel discussion. However, before getting started, I'd like to invite UCLAN's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Graham Baldwin, to give a brief welcome and introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted as the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Central Lancashire to be able to introduce today's, what I think is a very important webinar. The University of Central Lancashire is very proud of its role as a civic university, a university of and for the city and the regions and the places in which we operate. So I think it's very appropriate that we should host an event such as this today. We are very much, I think, an anchor institution, and we pride ourselves on the strong relationships that we have with key organisations who are represented here today. And we are committed to making a full contribution, as Mark has said, to the cities and the communities in which we exist. I'd obviously like to particularly offer a warm welcome to our three speakers today. Councillor Matthew Brown is leader of Preston City Council. Kate Rayworth is author of Doughnut Economics and a senior research associate at the University of Oxford. And John Barry, Professor of Green Political Economy at Queen's University Belfast. So big thank you to you for giving up your time and making a contribution this afternoon. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to everybody who's participating in today's event. Amazing interest. Mark has mentioned how many people have registered. I believe at the last count, over 700 people have registered to be involved today. And as we can hear by the pinging, many of them still joining us. But you're very, very welcome and thank you for coming. And the audience includes local politicians, academics, local authority officers, citizens and activists from across the world. Over 700 of you registered. I think it's a testimony to the nature of the event. The webinar itself is one of a series that's organised by UCLAN's Institute of Citizenship, Society and Change. And I would like to congratulate them, everybody who's involved in the Institute, on the success of their work and the organisation of today's event. The Institute was set up 3 years ago. The intention to foster transdisciplinary research and innovation, develop new ways of thinking about the 21st century challenges, and to advance well-being, public good, civil society, democracy, and sustainability. And all of that is particularly relevant at this current time. Indeed, probably couldn't be more so. The webinar contributes to a research project that's being led by Professor Mark Douris in collaboration with Preston City Council, the Community Gateway Association, and Preston Climate Action. It's funded by the ESRC supported place-based climate action network, and this aims to explore organisational and community experiences of COVID-19 and perceived connections to climate change, other ecological and social challenges. As part of this, the project will explore how the two economic models highlighted in today's event, i.e. the Preston model and the Doughnut model, can be brought together and potentially used to support transformative recovery. This is relevant from a university perspective, our university perspective, because we're currently writing and about to launch our new strategic plan, which will include civic engagement and sustainability, health and well-being, very much as overarching strategic priorities, and they will run through everything we do over the course of the life of that strategy. With the University and Preston City Council both having declared a climate emergency, this webinar, with its focus on the connections between democratic community wealth building, the economics of human and planetary thriving, and place-based climate action, is both timely and important. I congratulate my colleagues for pulling it together, everybody in the institution. I thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoy and have a great event. Thank you very much.
Lynn, you're muted.
I knew that would happen. Okay, off to a good start. I was just thanking you, Graham, for that introduction. And it's my honour today to introduce our three speakers, who together make up an extraordinary panel of practical, political and academic expertise. And we're delighted that they and you, the audience, have agreed to travel imaginatively to Preston for this event, because Preston has a huge stake as a city in new economic models and the development of new approaches to community well-being. So we will start, therefore, with a contribution from the leader of Preston Council, Matthew Brown, who has been a Labour councillor in Preston since 2002. He has made it his priority to champion practical and transformative alternatives to austerity and disinvestment. So retaining and developing local wealth and strengthening local communities and extending local democracy. So Matthew is the driving force, really, behind the Preston model of community wealth building that has been attracting nationwide interest for quite some time now as a transformative approach to local economic development. Partnership working with other local anchor institutions is central to Matthew's vision for community wealth building, for example, through the work of the local group of procurement practitioners, which includes representatives from across local government, education, housing, the police and health. Matthew has also led the way for Preston City Council to become accredited as a living wage employer, the first local authority in the Northwest to do so, and to commit to setting up a Northwest regional bank in partnership with Liverpool and rural councils. Finally, he's also helped to promote the cooperative economy in Preston, which has a proud heritage of cooperativism through, through Preston's Cooperative Development Network. And he's worked in partnership with UCLAN to secure funding in support of this initiative from the Open Society Foundation. A very warm welcome, Matthew. Thank you. People are still entering, I noticed. So I think we'll just go with the dinging, if you don't mind, and start your presentation now. After each speaker, we will have a few short questions before we go on to the general discussion at the end of the panel.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for the very warm invite. Lovely to be on the same platform as Kate and John, and a big thanks to yourself, Lynn, and also Graham for the introduction. Obviously, UCLAN have been a great partner with community wealth building, and long may that relationship continue. We've really got to all work together to improve the city for everyone and make sure that the wealth is shared across our community. So what I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes, a lot of you won't have heard of the Preston model. So I'm going to give you a brief 10 or 15 minutes overview of it and how these ideas are spreading, not just in Lancashire, but in many places. This is a very exciting new economic movement, and I hope that comes across within the presentation. Okay, really pleased to see so many people on this call. You know, we're trying to create something quite radical and transformative here, and so many people from Preston and Lancashire here. We need all of you to make this work, because there are alternatives. It doesn't have to be this way. We do not have to have these levels of inequality and, you know, environmental degradation and other things. You know, we can actually take control and build something much better. So I've done these slides. I do apologize. I don't think my PowerPoint skills are probably as good as the other two speakers, and sadly I'm gonna have to get someone to say next slide, because I've not been trained how to operate the thing myself, but I'll give it a go. Okay, so if we could move to the first slide, please. Right, so a number of you here might remember 10 years ago. So we in Preston for over 10 years, from the late 90s onwards, tried to work to secure quite significant inward investment to the city centre. So the late 90s, we started having conversations with quite large global developers, one of which was Lend-Lease and the other one was Grosvenor. And then for over 10 years, we pursued what was known as the Tide-Borne Regeneration Scheme. And the idea was we'd put land and assets in a partnership with these large global developers, and then that would have brought into Preston City Centre a John Lewis, a cinema, restaurants, housing, and all the rest of it. But sadly, that fell through when the economic crash of 2008 came. It was abandoned in 2011 when John Lewis's the anchor store said, "I'm afraid we're not going to invest in your community." You know, learning about it afterwards really is it might not have been that good for our community, because it would have put public land in a vehicle with quite large global developers. It would have put a lot of land into private ownership. A lot of the companies that would have refurbished our bus station and rebuilt our markets would have been local companies. That have been large corporations who themselves arguably don't treat local companies in the community through the supply chain very well. So that was abandoned in 2011. So we had to think differently, because big business doesn't want to come into Preston, and also austerity's kicking in as well. So basically we've got less money to spend in the public sector. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just very briefly, the Preston model came out of that reality. As I said earlier, we had a banking crash in 2007-8, in which I think 1.2 trillion of public money was used to bail out the banking system. The payback from that was austerity. I think that was equivalent to £20,000 per family to support the economy. And then, as I said, big business didn't want to come in through the Tide-Borne Regeneration Scheme. So community wealth building, the Preston model, has come from a number of things. Some are very common sense and practical, others are quite transformative, but here they are. Firstly, we realised in Preston that we're the administrative centre of Lancashire. We've been obsessed with trying to get money in from outside Preston through, you know, large businesses and other things. But inside Preston, we've got two councils that headquartered here. We've got a very large housing association, we've got a university, we've got a hospital, police force nearby. So we realised that there's lots of wealth in our community anyway, and these anchor institutions, whether it's the council, the county council, UCLAN or the NHS, were spending nearly £1 billion per annum on goods and services, and we weren't really analysing where that was going. So we wanted to make sure a lot more was spent with locally based companies. And this was the 6 original institutions in the Preston model for 2013. Now we've got UCLAN and the NHS. The NHS, for example, has spent nearly £3 million buying masks for a Preston-based company, which has led to 90 jobs locally. So the idea was we use the wealth that's here anyway to actually ripple that through the community, mainly through supporting local companies, a living wage, apprentices, and social and environmental benefits as well. We also encourage insourcing. So in the last 15 years or so, well, 20 or 30 years, the public sector has been pressured in many ways to outsource a lot of services. The council's brought back some facilities, management of venues and other things. The police have brought back custody suites away from, I think, G4S. And Community Gateway is insourced. The largest housing association in Preston has insourced lots of stuff back into that housing association. We realised as well that in Preston we're part of a very large public pension fund, which is worth about £9 billion. And that is wealth in our community anyway. It's the deferred earnings of the council workers, other workers of the public sector, and that's invested in places. And very little of this was being invested directly in Preston. So we had a conversation with the fund, and it's agreed to invest £100 million in Preston and South Ribble, the neighbouring district, in student flats and hotel and office space. And we wanted to go a lot further as well. We want to invest a lot more in Preston and Lancashire in the green economy. I also, myself and people like Councillor Rawlinson, who's a cabinet member in Preston who supported me in community wealth building, we also got really interested in economic alternatives. Now, these alternatives do work. So if you go to the Basque region of Spain, in a place called Mondragon, that region around Bilbao area, you see a network of over 100 worker-owned businesses that have a turnover of, I think, 15 billion euros, and they're one of the most successful companies in Spain. So we thought we want to bring a bit of that principle to Preston. So we're establishing 10 new worker-owned businesses with the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, which is what I mentioned before, that big set of cooperatives in Spain. UCLAN and the Preston Cooperative Development Network to establish a number of worker-owned businesses in Preston. We've got 3 or 4 already, but obviously we want to have initially dozens, then hundreds of people who work in worker-owned firms or employee-owned firms. We're looking to establish the Northwest Community Bank because the reality is that the banks in 2007-8 caused the mess that we're in, and their behaviour led to austerity. I want to establish a Northwest Regional Cooperative Bank, a community bank that will be an alternative to the large banks. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then we want to make Preston a living wage place. Preston Council was the first employer in the north of England to pay the real living wage, now £9.50 an hour. Other place-based institutions do as well. I believe UCLAN is moving towards it as well. And the idea is that the institutions that aren't going to get up and leave, they set a standard around paying higher wages of at least £9.50 an hour. As I said before, we're not working with large developers solely now. We're promoting ownership, and the new cinema we're going to develop in the city centre, which is going to be cinema, restaurant and a bowling alley. Crucially, that is going to be the ownership of the city. So it's going to be in municipal ownership. So any profits go back to the city and can be spent on services. We're looking at how the council can look to deliver public housing once again, because like many councils, we don't have a housing stock. We're looking at whether we can establish a company or re-establish a housing revenue account. Our planning policies encourage local suppliers of labour on both public and private sector development. So, for example, we had a Porsche showroom in the docks a few years back that was built, used local companies to build it, local people employed. And then we're going to refresh our community wealth building strategy soon, and please come to that launch on the 25th of February. Next slide, please. Yeah, so some of these examples do actually work. On the left is a German banking system, not-for-profit, called the Sparkassen. On the right is the Bank of North Dakota, which is in America, which is a publicly owned bank. And crucially, those banks, in Germany, the not-for-profit banks were lending to local businesses in 2007-8, whereas we were bailing out the large banks. And the Bank of North Dakota, because that predominates within that state in America, I think the majority of banking services are done through it. Unemployment was about 40% of the average in America when the 2007-8 crash came. So we're quite inspired by these alternatives, not-for-profit banking, either community, cooperative or public banking. So next slide, please. So we're going to establish the Northwest Mutual. This has been registered with the Financial Conduct Authority. It's going to be a regional cooperative bank. We're hoping to have reports to our next council this month. And crucially, if we move to the next slide, why do we want to do this? And again, please. Yes, and one more time. What you see is that the large banks tend to want to lend to each other. So on the left is the big four large banks that have withdrawn from our high street in many ways. They'd rather lend to other financial companies rather than lend, say, a whole lot of £20,000 to small businesses in our community. Or on the right is the it's a bit old, from 2013 to 17, but it just shows how loans by the large banks to small businesses has fallen. In Preston, that's been by 30%. So our bank will challenge that, and it'll lend to local businesses and lend to local people excluded from the banking system. Next slide, please. And again, I mentioned about the public sector pension fund. This is another example in America. This is the Public Pension Fund of Alabama. The chief executive of it got quite heavily criticized at the time, but he said in the late 80s, I want to have at least 10% invested within my state. So it built a number of golf courses, hotels, it acquired media companies, all owned by the public sector pensioners. And just on the right is the economic benefit of doing that over that period of 21 years. And you see the amount of jobs created, the amount of earnings for the state, including through taxation and additional GDP. So in Preston, if we move to the next slide, we've adopted those principles to a degree. And again, this is, I mean, people probably remember that I used to have nights out there in the 90s and noughties. When I was at university, it was like that for quite a number of years, and that has been replaced by a building that was actually, it's now owned by the public sector pensioners, student accommodation. Used a not-for-profit development company 2 or 3 miles away from Preston, local people employed on the project, over 200. They pay council tax, so we get the receipt, the company pays business rates and they're supported, and the students contribute to the community. Next slide, please. And again, this is a second development. It's just beginning. This is going to be the public pension fund in the Park Hotel. Again, a local authority building in disuse. That's going to be reclaimed as a hotel. And again, the public pension fund will be developing that and using a local development company and local suppliers as well, creating jobs. Next slide, please. I mentioned the cinema. We're hoping to get on with this later this year. Obviously, the pandemic's got in the way, but this will be the cinema in the city of Preston. Preston Council's taken the decision that we're going to build it, we're going to own it, we're going to have a say over local supply chain, the way they treat the workers, the way they treat the environment, social value. Could we potentially get cooperatives in the supply chain? You know, we're going to look at all these things and potentially employ people who might have lost their jobs through the pandemic. So because we actually own it, we're going to have control of what happens within the development and also have the benefits of owning that, as well as the community has benefits as well. Next slide, please. And again, I mentioned about the repatriation of spend. So in 2013, just 5% for the 6 anchor institutions were spent within Preston, just by working with, especially with an organisation called CLES based in Manchester. That had increased to 18.2% in 2017. So UCLan got involved in this at the same time, you know, going through the books, making sure local companies can win contracts, and I think tens of millions have been won by local construction companies, and they always have a family of subcontractors. So that was a £75 million repatriation of public spend to our local economy. Next slide, please. Yeah, a few other things. That's two cabinet members on Preston Council, Robert on the left, Peter on the right. That's when we brought back the management of the Pavilion Cafe. It's a conference centre as well on Avon Park into local authority control. They're looking a lot happier than they are around me, maybe the food that they're having there and the coffee as well. But that was us celebrating when we've insourced that activity back into the council. Next slide, please. Yeah, and we've got a new cabinet member, Councillor Freddie Bailey, who's taking this agenda forward. He's really taken to it like a duck to water. I mean, the strategic mind he has on developing these ideas is fantastic, but the council has shown its commitment by establishing a cabinet position for community wealth building. And we'll hear from Freddie on the 25th of February for our Preston Model 2 relaunch. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is another of our new worker-owned businesses. So this is the larder, so that's on a council building. It was the first worker co-op out of the Preston model, employed 6 people, living wage employer, and crucially, that's a worker co-op. So, you know, it's got that internal democracy, they source locally. The idea is they're going to bid for contracts that leak out of the local economy, and hopefully, it's like, you know, employ more people and the cooperative will expand. Next slide, please. And again, this is a second worker cooperative. It's called Preston Digital Foundation. And please forgive my poor IT skills. I had to lift that from the website. So again, very interesting. This has come out of the University of Central Lancashire. So this is graduates, and I think students and a lecturer that have formed a worker co-op. Fantastic it is as well. It's a digital business. There's 7 in them. They're actually a supplier to the university as well. And the idea is we create a lot more of these businesses going forward. And I think Mark, who was behind this, is saying, well, if we can get one of these worker co-ops in digital, we can have 3, 4, 5 in Preston. Next slide, please.
2 minutes, Matthew.
Yeah, I knew I was going to get cut off soon, but I'll try to be as quick as I can. So these are the ideas we have about how to bring community wealth building into the green economy in the Preston Model 2 relaunch. So a lot of it's also about ownership of the economy. So we want to make sure there's more public ownership and community ownership within Preston. Next slide, please. Yeah, and all these ideas, I mean, it's mainly the procurement and employment work at the moment, and living wage helped us be named the most improved city in 2018 by PricewaterhouseCoopers Demos. And next slide. And again, you can see in that year, and this coincided with the Preston model really taking effect, especially around public improvement. You can see how the improvements in jobs especially really did eclipse the improvements in the 42 other cities. So we're very proud of that. We're actually the most, for economic well-being, we're the best place to live and work in the Northwest. Next slide, please. And again, these ideas are spreading, and they're spreading very quickly. So that's Michael Sheen. Actually, a number of these people came to UCLan. Michael Sheen has been to UCLan for a symposium with Julian Manley and others. And again, this is Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. I mentioned how they're an inspiration to us, a network of worker co-ops in that part of Spain. Do everything from banking, retail, university, they're all in the ownership of the workers, and the life expectancy, the inequality they managed to tackle there, it's amazing. Next slide, please. So just in the UK, this is where it's happening in many places. Many councils are insourcing services. Islington has insourced, I think, 400 million back into the local council, resulted in 1,400 people receiving the London living wage. The Welsh Assembly is helping to set up a Welsh community bank like our bank. Plymouth and Oxford are doubling the size of the cooperative economy. North Ayrshire is encouraging worker and employee ownership. Hackney especially is delivering energy to its citizens by a municipal energy company. The Scottish Government has recently launched a community wealth building approach in 6 areas of the country, and crucially, very much in the mainstream, the NHS and the Civic Universities Commission see what economic and social role universities and hospitals have in communities to actually tackle poverty and lead to economic well-being in terms of who they employ, where they spend, and what they do with their assets. Next slide. And I'm nearly done now. So this is how this is actually an international movement. So in Tanzania, we've had a visit from an MP there who's looking to strengthen the connection with Preston, especially around cooperatives and community banking. City of Sydney Council has adopted a community wealth building approach to public procurement. I think in San Francisco, as well as California, they're looking to establish a publicly owned bank because they say they don't want to be at the mercy of Wall Street and all the kind of like the deindustrialization that causes and all the inequality. New York City is expanding worker-owned businesses, and European Union, we lead on a project in Preston in 7 cities to look at how big institutions can help economic, social and societal benefits. And interestingly, the trade union movement in America, much smaller than here, is actively looking to buy quite large companies as employee-owned trusts where they're actually unionised. So there's what's known as union co-ops, and we're looking to establish this here with major kind of like unions here as well. So if this all comes together in the way that it might do, potentially this is a post-1945 economic system that is just in the infancy of an architecture and infrastructure that's taking place. And obviously quite a small authority in Preston, but the fact we're behind this conversation is really exciting. And I, for one, as leader, I'm determined to make sure we actually build an economic model that actually isn't going to just favour multimillionaires, isn't going to see the levels of poverty that we see in our communities, and the lack of hope that you see in our communities, and the mental health impact that has by being poor. You know, the biggest social determinant of ill health is the fact you're in poverty. The economic system has to begin tackling poverty, or else what is it for? So just very, very finally, if we move to the last slide, please attend. This is a very shameless plug. I do apologise for this. We've got our own Community Wealth Building 2 Preston Model relaunch, which will be on the 25th of February, 6:30 to 8:30. Some big name speakers there. There's going to be a representative from New York City, very high up, who's going to speak there. We've got a Guardian journalist, former Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell MP is going to be there. So please come along to that. And thank you very much. I'm sorry if I overrun, but I hope people found that exciting. But let's all work together to build a kind of local community and economy that we can do. We've had enough of this, and especially with the COVID pandemic, we can't go back to what we had before. We've got to build something new and better. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matthew, for that first presentation of the afternoon, which I think's hopefully fired everybody up and given us a really good overview of Preston's approach, and really exciting as well that it's leading up to a kind of relaunch of 2.0, which I'm sure we'll hear more about in the panel discussion. So I've got a few questions. They're coming in thick and fast. So before we move on to our next speaker, question from Stephen Morton. Is there a danger that national political directives might undermine local cooperative economic strategies? For instance, by legislating on competitive tendering or reductions in environmental standards and employee protections?
Yes, there is. But I came to the conclusion some time ago that, you know, the current restrictions on local government in this country, we are the most centralised in the European Union. If you go to Norway or Amsterdam or Berlin, you know, you have choices that we don't. So there is that danger. So we're doing this in a framework that really is anti-local government, because local government hasn't been supported for some time. But I mean, I come to the conclusion that the way we can actually get around this is just by supporting our own institutions. So if we establish a regional cooperative bank, which we're going to invest in as a council, then that'll lend to cooperatives. Cooperatives have a difficulty in actually getting the support to form, but also in getting access from the large banks. So we'll do that. If we build a cinema that's going to be owned by the council, again, that's us taking control in our own way. If we build public housing again through a company, you know, if we support worker ownership, you know, these are putting our own democratic institutions in place in Preston that will kind of override in many ways the restrictions that are put in place by government. And that's my strategy with it all, to be honest. But to do it, you know, it can't just be the council. We've got to get wide support and consensus for it across, you know, both the public and private sector, you know, because it's very transformative stuff. But I've been making the argument all along that the motivation behind this is to bring more equality and tackle poverty, because, you know, we're still a very deprived community in Preston. The levels of child poverty, they've gone down in the last year. Very pleased, but it's still very high. Traditionally very deprived, like, you know, Blackburn, Blackpool, Burnley in the community. And, you know, we've got to lift people up in this city. And, you know, I've come to the conclusion that doing it by neoliberal economics isn't going to work. So we've got to actually put our own institutions in place. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, and a second question that I think is very current with what I've been listening to on the radio and TV in the last couple of weeks. Many cities are now facing gaping holes in their high streets. What are the first steps you'd recommend councils to take to enable community involvement in revitalising city centre retail space?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And also we've had the loss of Arcadia and Debenhams, and it was that kind of economic model which is really extractive, which doesn't look after workers, consumers, the environment and the community. I mean, having the dominance of that on our high street is a risk, isn't it? So we need more diverse ownership in the high street. On the high street, we got some fantastic names like Richer Sounds. I mean, that, you know, Julian's, he's transferred 60% of his company to the employees. You got Lush, again, living wage employer, employees have 10%. Those kind of ownership models we've got to promote, really. So the high street's protected from, you know, the extractive kind of like behavior of quite predatory corporations that just want to make a short-term profit. In terms of what we're going to face, it's very scary, isn't it? But, you know, I think there's a conversation about more community ownership of the high street. And I think the NHS has a big role. We're going to need to help people after this pandemic. There's going to be people who have long COVID. People's mental health is going to be badly damaged. There's going to be people with complex.
Oh, we've lost you. You've gone on to mute, Matthew.
Oh, I do apologise. Sorry. Do you want me to start again with the whole answer? I don't know.
No, it's only the last few seconds actually. So
yeah, I think there's a case for looking at how we can have more community ownership of the high street and potentially have community facilities post-COVID, so people can talk about what they've been through and actually recover from that. But in Preston, we've got a towns fund which is going to look at some of our disused assets and whether we can have more cooperative community ownership in there, which is very exciting. But, you know, I think we need a collective effort to make sure we reimagine the high street, and especially around making sure it's environmentally friendly as well. You know, it's not going to be like it was 30 or 40 years ago when I was a little lad and your mum would go shopping with you, you know, and that was the thing that most mothers did, really. It's changed, hasn't it? It needs to be more of a cultural space. It needs to be more of a community space because things are shifting online and other things. So that's my answer to that. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and I think that's raised a number of issues that I'm sure we'll want to explore further later, particularly that idea of reimagining as we move forward from recovery. So I'll hand over to Lynn, who's going to introduce our next speaker. Thanks again, Matthew.
Thank you very much for that. That was lucid and inspirational, actually, to hear what's going on in Preston in such a nice compact presentation. Just to remind those people that came in late, we're harvesting questions from the chat. There are far too many for people to be able to ask those questions themselves, but please keep them coming on the chat. So for our next speaker, it's a great pleasure to introduce Kate Rayworth, whose work many of you will be familiar with. And if you're not, then you should know that Kate is an economist whose huge and vital project is no less than making economics fit for the 21st century. Her book, Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, has been translated into 18 languages, and it is an international bestseller. In 2017, it was longlisted for Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year award, and it has fueled vigorous international debate, learning, and action on how to organize economies locally and globally to support a safe and just space for humanity. The range and diversity of Kate's work is impressive, and her audiences range from the United Nations General Assembly to the Occupy movement. Kate is also co-founder of Doughnut Economics Action Lab, working with cities, business, communities, and educators to bring about transformation, and she teaches at Oxford University Environmental Change Institute and is Professor of Practice at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I have to say, I've just been waiting for this webinar for so long. I'm just really thrilled we're having this conversation. So first of all, I'm going to say that I'm going to share my slides afterwards, and I'll give them to the organizers, and they can be put together with the video of this webinar if anybody wants to go back over them. And I just want to say I hugely enjoyed Matthew's presentation, and he took us deep, deep, deep into the nitty gritty of how they're making this happen in Preston, which is, of course, where the secrets lie. It's in the details that we get the true inspiration to action. I'm going to go in a different direction. I'm going to start the opposite end, but our presentations are so connected. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And yeah, I'm going to talk about donuts, and I'm going to imagine bringing the donut to Preston. So I want to pull us out. I'm going to pull us out on this, what is it, Thursday afternoon, pull us out of Preston, pull us out of the UK, there's wonderful people participating from all over the world. So let's just pull back into the whole world and think about the beginning of the 21st century, because this century has begun with repeated crises. We are living them again and again and again, from the financial meltdown of 2008 to the ongoing climate and ecological breakdown that is the era in which we live, to the ongoing COVID lockdown experienced everywhere. And what these crises tell us is that we're deeply interconnected with each other and with the rest of the living world. They tell us that their impacts fall with really sharp inequalities of gender and of race, of wealth and power, of global north and global south. And fascinatingly, I think these crises emerge from the very systems that we've created. They are crises based upon systems that depend upon endless expansion. So if you create a financial system that aims to endlessly expand, you'll probably end up with a subprime mortgage market. If you create an industrial system and an energy system that endlessly increases its use of fossil fuels and Earth's resources, you will induce climate breakdown and ecological breakdown. And if human settlements continually expand into wildlife areas, and then we endlessly are traveling, flying between our nations, we create perfect conditions for zoonotic disease and a global health pandemic. So I think these crises are a very, very powerful message that we have to listen to, that endless expansion is not the shape of progress. It was a 20th century vision that progress lies in endless growth and expansion, but actually we need a new vision. And so for this, I offer one version, which is the Doughnut, where the aim is to leave no one in the hole in the middle, falling short on the essentials of life without the resources that people need for health and education and housing, and food and water and community and political voice and gender and social equity and income. And these are crowdsourced from the world's governments. So every government in the world has agreed that all people in the world have a claim to these essentials. That's not controversial. Leave no one in the donut's hole. But at the same time, don't overshoot the outer ring, because there we put so much pressure on our planet. We break down Earth's life supporting systems. We overshoot these 9 planetary boundaries, which hold life in balance on this delicately balanced, unique planet in the universe. So the goal, in the simplest of words, is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. Simple. But it completely changes the shape of progress, because now what progress looks like is no longer endless expansion. It's thriving in balance, and it's more like a heartbeat. And it takes us back to knowing that bodily health lies in balance, and we need to see that planetary health lies in balance in humanity's relationship with the living world. But if our health lies in balance, well, we are very far from balance. This is a global picture. We can see people falling short. The majority of those people live, of course, in the global south, but we know there's extreme deprivation, even in the UK, one of the world's richest countries, and in high income countries the world over. But we are already, while we've got that strong excess of human deprivation, we're already in ecological overshoot. We are pushing past this planet's capacity to sustain us. So we need to find a new form of balance, and it's a place we've never been to before. This is a picture of humanity at the global scale. And we often bring it down to the national scale, but I'm going to go straight here to the scale of the city. What happens when people say, I like this idea, we want to live where we meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. Can we do it here? And since this was first published as an idea in 2012, people have been trying to downscale the donut to where they live, to their town, to their neighborhood, to their city, to their nation. And over the last year and a half, together with the C40, with Janine Benyus, a brilliant biomimicry thinker, and circular economy, we've created a methodology that we believe really works. So I'm going to imagine bringing this, downscaling it to Preston. So we invite all cities and places and towns to ask themselves this question. I invite you to ask this through the lens of where you are. So how can Preston become a home to thriving people in a thriving place, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And that's a complex question. In it lie 4 independent questions. The first is, what would it mean for the people of Preston to thrive? Well, of course, only the people of Preston can say what it means for them to thrive, given their values, their culture, their history, their diversity. What is a good life in Preston, and how well are you doing and compared to that? And that's an amazing conversation for the community to have. Put that together with what would it mean for Preston to thrive within its natural habitat? I mean, where on planet Earth is Preston? Located in a unique spot on Earth's biomes, nestled in the ecosystem of which it's a part. And how can it actually belong in that ecosystem? So if Janine Benyus the brilliant biomimicry thinker I work with on this, were here, she'd say, take us to the wildland next door, the nearest forest, the wildlife, the natural ecosystem that you've got. And let's go there and measure how nature's sequestering carbon dioxide there, and how nature's storing groundwater and cooling the air and housing biodiversity and cleaning the air. What if that was the ambition for the city? What if the city could mimic nature's generosity here? This is what she calls ecological performance standard. It's a truly wildly ambitious standard, but it's utterly natural, and that we begin to make our cities and towns and neighborhoods belong as part of the ecosystem. So these two are thriving people in a thriving place, and that's local aspiration. And you could be in a place and say, wow, it's great life here, there's great atmosphere and environment here, but it's only part of the story, because we know that every city and place is embedded in a web of global relationships. And so we need to take global responsibility as well. So we ask, what would it mean for Preston to respect the health of the whole planet? All of the clothing and food and electronics and consumer goods and construction materials that are brought into the city, where are they coming from? And what impact are they having on the planet? What pressure are they putting? And any of us living in high income societies, we have to know that our cities and our nations are putting way more than our share of pressure on the planet. And we need to bring that right back in. So what would it mean for Preston to do that? And think again of the supply chains of clothing and food and electronics, and who are the people involved in those supply chains? What would it mean for Preston to respect the well-being of people worldwide? Just people outside the city, even in different parts of the Northwest, but also people in the supply chains worldwide. How can the city know that it's respecting their rights too? So we've got local aspirations set in the context of global responsibility. And if you're looking at that thinking that's a lot to take on, it is, but these questions don't go away if we don't ask them. And they're all deeply interconnected. So we've begun asking these questions with cities, and we've began with Portland, Philadelphia, and Amsterdam. And these are from some workshops in 2019, where we had actually got their city goals, got the best available data, and plotted those to give a holistic snapshot of their cities through all 4 of those lenses. And these are policymakers and community members in those cities looking at their city through that lens for the first time. The beauty of it and the ugliness of it, because it's all there. And looking to see how everything is interconnected. And the conversations that were so clearly people who just wanted to work holistically and not work in their silos anymore, and find ways to interconnect what they were doing. So what kind of solutions are going to come? We believe that there are 2 major dynamics we need to transform in our economies, both city level and nationally, indeed globally. And the first is, oh, my slide's stopping, hang on. The first is to move from degenerative design, where we take Earth's materials, make it into stuff we want, use it for a while, and throw it away. And those linear degenerative arrows are pushing us over Earth's life support systems. That's what's running down the planet. So we need to bend those arrows around and create regenerative designs where resources aren't used up, they're used again and again in a circular or cyclical economy. So we work with and within the cycles of the living world. Waste from one process becomes food for the next. It's modular. We shift from ownership to service. This is a connected, collaborative economy. What can that look like in practice? 4 quick illustrations. Oslo has made its city centre car free, so you can get around by tram and foot and bicycle, but they've got rid of the fossil fuel cars. Paris took the advantage of COVID and turned some of its major avenues into cycle lanes, so allowing that new economy, the new transport, to suddenly come through with a lick of yellow paint. Amsterdam is putting in place circular economy regulation in construction, so saying, you know, by 2030, half of the materials in our city need to be circular materials. They need to be being reused. Only half of them can be new. And that sends a very clear signal right now to anybody involved in construction and development. And of course, it's reusing materials. It's creating local jobs, reinventing construction. And then the city of Medellin in Colombia, which used to treat the river as a fantastically useful industrial sewer, said, hang on, the river is actually the heart of the ecology of this city. Let's open it up. The river is life. Let's create parks. So let's respect where we are on planet Earth. These are just 4 illustrations of regenerative design. But we also need distributive design. So we need to move from cities through their structure, through those economies and their technologies and the ownership that are divisive, by driving opportunity and value into few hands. We've definitely got a divisive global economy. Over the last decade, The number of billionaires worldwide has doubled from 1,000 billionaires to 2,000 billionaires. But we know many countries have economies that are driving resources into few hands, and we need to make them distributive so that they share opportunity and value with all in society who co-create that. A few examples. Well, I always start with Preston because it's a great example of community wealth building. And Matthew's spoken so much to that, but I love this photograph just saying we just rebuilt the marketplace with local construction companies so that there was somewhere for local traders to try a new enterprise, sell their wares, connect and meet each other. But then there's also affordable housing. In the city of Vienna, more than 60% of people live in housing that's owned by the city or city-run co-ops, which makes it affordable, high quality and highly equitable. Seattle was one of the first cities in the US to introduce a living wage of $15 an hour. People said, well, no one will be able to afford to go to restaurants anymore. It turned out that everyone could afford, even the wait staff in restaurants could now afford to go to restaurants. And then in Bogota, literally distributive design of public spaces, turning car parks like this into play parks like this, so the community have place to meet, creating public luxury, as George Monbiot calls it. So how are we going to get regenerative distributive design? I think it ultimately depends upon the design of the city's own institutions. And I invite everybody to think about city institutions that you know may be part of through these lenses. So 20th century cities were very often serving growth, and city policymakers have told me, yeah, we were always asking, how can we make our city grow? How can we grow our city GDP? Isn't that the goal? But actually 21st century city policymakers I talk to are asking just a very different question. How can we make our city thrive in the full range of what that means? And there are 5 key design traits that I think unlock which side of this divide a city gets to dance on. And they are these 5, and I'm going to give examples quickly of each one. So purpose. What is your city's purpose? I mean, what does your city actually have a vision for? What's it in service of creating? The city of Amsterdam, they told us, well, we have a circular strategy. We're going to have a circular economy. We have a sustainability strategy. We have an energy strategy. We want to do it with social value and equity. And when they encountered the Doughnut, they said, you know what, it just brings together what we already are doing. So they adopted the Doughnut unilaterally and said, we make this a model for our city. And they made in Amsterdam orange. This is our model now. And it sits like an umbrella concept over everything that we do. It makes sense of it all. And their city has a vision of being a thriving, inclusive, regenerative city for all residents while respecting the planetary boundaries. To me, that is a transformative vision. When you hear a mayor start to talk like that, not growth and competition, but thriving and collaboration, then you know you've got the beginnings of transformation. But of course, it has to go beyond the speeches. So secondly is the networks. And again, this is a place where Preston is an inspiration to the world, that role of anchor institutions. So again, in Amsterdam, using circular procurement from 2022, 10% of all materials involved in city contracts have to be circular materials. Cleveland, Ohio, which Matthew was mentioning, realized that their city hospitals are based in a low-income neighborhood, but they were recruiting from far away. So they designed a scheme to employ people from that low-income neighborhood, mothers returning to work, people who may have had a conviction, help them get past that and create good jobs in the community. And then in Melbourne, they aggregated a contract between many city players, offered a 10-year contract with a fixed price for electricity, and that led to the construction of a wind farm. It brought forward the future of energy because they put those contracts together. So the power of the procurement for networks. Governance, the role of citizens' assemblies is rising across the world. Using ambitious regulations, again, Amsterdam have said from 2025, all boats in the city must be electric. From 2030, no fossil fuel vehicles in the city. That's a very, very clear sign to anybody involved in transport there. Switch or be pushed out. And then lastly, learning by experiment. Learning by experiment and using new metrics to measure how we're doing. So Bijksloterham is a district in Amsterdam that was going to be an industrial development that fell through. There's something about industrial developments falling through that makes opportunity. They said, okay, let's use it as a circular living lab. Anything that gets built here has to be circular. We learn and then we bring it to the rest of the city. And from our city, then we can learn and take it to the rest of the country. And of course, Preston now saying we're going to experiment having a universal basic income is another example of a place saying, let's find out whether this policy works by trying it, and then we'll know. Ownership. Matthew brought this up time and again. Great, I'll be there. Time and again. Who owns the land and the housing and the cinemas in developments, and why can't the local community own it through the city council? All the difference it made in Vienna. Who owns the utilities, the electricity company, the water company, and how can the value of that again be reinvested in the city and its life? Who owns the data? Barcelona is a city that's committed to open data and data sovereignty and designing that future valuable asset openly with its citizens. And again, who owns business? Is it big business? And therefore, what are they bringing and giving to your city or taking? Or is it small enterprise? And what can your city be doing to enable local enterprise to thrive in the high street? And of course, this brings us lastly to finance, which sits at the bottom of this table. It lies deepest, like the most powerful thing. So where does the city get its revenue from? Cities like Portland in the US have relied very significantly on car parking charges. So what are you going to do if you're going to take the cars out of the city centre? Where is the revenue going to come from instead? Matthew was talking again about the big banks just not providing finance to small and medium enterprises locally. So more and more cities setting up their own banks and credit unions to provide that accessible, affordable finance for their own ecosystem of enterprise. And then what are cities doing with their investments and divestments? Again, great examples from Matthew. Another example here, 12 cities got together and said, we commit to divesting our city pensions from fossil fuel funds and investing in regenerative funds. So those 5 design traits. And again, I'm asking here for Preston, I invite you to ask anywhere, how can the city ensure that all 5 of these design traits are aligned with enabling it to thrive? What's holding it back? And what's already enabling it to thrive? And what can other actors in the city do to work with the city council, work with the anchor institutions to make sure that everybody is bringing that about? Last slide. If you like these ideas that I'm presenting from the frame of Doughnut economics, we've got an action lab of some wonderful, inventive and slightly crazy change makers around the world who are using it and bringing it alive in their own communities, be they teachers and community groups, businesses, city practitioners, governments. Anyone can join as an individual, join up. There's events, there's tools and there's stories, and you can learn from other change makers. And I think just the sheer example of Preston shows us that what's most inspiring to people is someone who's just like themselves, who's already doing that thing they thought was impossible. So a city councillor to a city councillor, a mayor to a mayor, a school child to a school child, or a teacher to a teacher, or a CEO or new employee to their equivalent. So here we celebrate the work of what people are doing, because we know this is spreading inspiration on the scale that's needed, the scale of transformation that we need to bring about this decade. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kate, for a fantastic presentation. And having heard you before, I'm not at all surprised that you've managed to distill so much into that time, but also challenge us and give us new things to think about. So just a couple of questions before we move on to our final speaker, John. A question from Sonia, very close to another question from the O'Haras. How important is redesigning the education system in the success of implementing a new economic model, to implementing the Doughnut and tackling the climate crisis?
Well, it's huge, because I believe the fundamental transformation that needs to happen is right here in our heads. We need to start by recognizing that the economy is a subset of the living world and utterly dependent upon it and drawing on it and putting waste into it. And until all economists have that as the 101, day one of their educational training, we've not got a chance with economics. But every child has a right to learn that. Just as we learn about bodily health and that our bodily health lies in balance, every child should learn about the planet's health and the planetary systems, that they also need to be kept in balance. So yes, we have to redesign education. That said, we could never say that's the answer. It lies on you, next generation. We're going to start, let's start with the 4-year-olds and so hope they come out better. No, we have to write it into everything we do now and just keep remaking these models. I really sincerely believe that 21st century economics is going to be practiced first and theorized later. Indeed, from webinars like this one, we can see it is being practiced first. So even though the economics departments actually are pretty much, to my mind, the slowest to move and to take on these ideas, MBAs, urban studies, development studies, they're all on it. Economics departments are not on it. But here, sincerely, this is where 21st century economics is being rewritten, and it will be theorized later and reflected in how it actually came about.
Thank you. And a question from Paul. I'd be very interested in your definition of regeneration. I'm asking because restoring vital signs doesn't necessarily equate to thriving.
Oh, that's quite a specific question. Well, I'm going to give it a slightly more general one. So I think we need, think of 3 stages. There's degenerative design, which runs down the living world. And I think we've had since probably about 1987, a move towards sustainability, which is doing no harm. So 100% less bad. So that the whole net zero carbon emissions movement is sort of towards doing no harm, net zero wastewater, net zero harm to workers, net zero, or zero child labor in your supply chains. Like, but the regenerative designer Bill McDonough would say, well, why aim to be just 100% less bad? Like, nature doesn't do zero. Nature is generous. Nature has cycles. So nature regenerates and breaks things down and gives back. And actually, trees in nature that comb fog out of the air, they share the moisture with trees around them. There's a mutualism and a reciprocity in nature. So to me, that is at the heart of regeneration. But on Paul's question, of course, you have to be very careful about which metrics you use, and always the danger of targets, that if they become the focus, you focus on the target rather than actually the health of the whole system. So there's a lot, and I think we actually in the very early days are understanding what regeneration means. The word is flying around a lot. Let's make sure it doesn't get co-opted. Let's make sure it gets deepened in meaning through being able to point to good practice.
Thanks very much, Kate. And thanks again for giving us so much to think about and discuss a bit later on. Okay, Lynn, going to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you. Yes, and I love the fact that you ended on the note of generativity there. And that leads in very well to our final speaker. We're delighted to welcome John Barry, who is Professor of Green Political Economy and Director of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action at Queen's University, Belfast. His areas of academic research include post-growth and heterodox political economy, the politics, policy and political economy of climate breakdown and climate resilience, and also socio-technical analysis of low-carbon energy transitions. As with other panelists, he has a strong normative commitments to green political theory, civic republicanism, gender, class, and environmental justice. And he's also a place-based action network investigator, and since January 2020 has been co-chair of the Belfast Climate Commission. His latest book is The Politics of Actually Existing Unsustainability, Human Flourishing in a Climate-Changed, Carbon-Constrained World. Welcome, John.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
John, I have to include the more personal note, actually, because I thought this was really important. Because on a personal and related note, John tells us he is father of 2. And he tells us also that what keeps him awake at night are the life opportunities and future well-being of his children. He's also a recovering politician, if you ever can recover from being a politician, having been Green Party councillor from 2011 to 2018 on the Ards and North Down Council. Thank you, John.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lynn. I'm delighted to be here. It's absolutely wonderful. Like Kate and Matthew, very much looking forward to the conversation that we'll have. I'm going to reflect in a way to try and do the impossible to bring the Doughnut and the community wealth building model together with a particular inflection on the importance of the pandemic. And as we recover from the pandemic, what are the lessons we can learn? What are the directions of travel that we can engage in terms of building back better from the pandemic? So I begin by saying that the pandemic in my mind has cancelled the future, but that's okay. It was a pretty crap one. Anyhow, why on earth do we want to go back to normal? The BC economy, the before COVID economy. And I think we should resist those calls, even though we can kind of understand them, to go back to normal. The reality is the economy that existed prior to COVID was not working for everybody. Massive levels of inequality, not really contributing for many people to human flourishing, and of course, high levels of ecological irrationality. The difference between now and the moment that we're in comparison to the other crash that we went through as societies 10 years ago or so, is that in the past crash, we bailed out the banks, i.e. states via taxpayers' money and so on, bailing out the banks. Now governments have been forced to bail out the people. And let's hope that we haven't forgotten that there is a magic money tree, Mrs. May. Why is there always money for war, but not for the NHS or for education? This is a teachable moment in terms of the power of the state, in terms of being able to finance any particular transition that we'd like to engage in. And so I do think we can learn lessons from how states and how societies and citizens have responded to the COVID emergency, and what can we learn then to address, as both Kate and Matthew have alluded to, in terms of the planetary crisis, in terms of the ecological and climate crisis we're facing. But particularly the importance, and this is where the localizing, whether it's the Doughnut being applied to Amsterdam or elsewhere, or the Preston version of community wealth building, is that we need to really see this place-based relocalization of our attention, our desires, our visions of the future, without forgetting the importance of national and international level cooperation. But we need to dig where we stand, as my father, a wise peasant from County Mayo, would often say. Another wise peasant, perhaps, although a multimillionaire peasant, is this man here, Warren Buffett. Certainly wouldn't be my ideological cup of tea. But I think this has captured, in a way, certainly for me, what the pandemic has shown is severe structural weaknesses in our economy. The fact that while it was great on the one hand that we all clapped of a Thursday for the NHS and retail workers, why are these people not getting decent wages? Why are they in precarious contracts? What about the gendered nature of that care labour that we now see as so central? So again, lessons that I hope our citizens and indeed our policymakers learn as a result of what we're dealing with in the pandemic. And of course, many of you have seen this particular image that's doing the social media rounds. I think it nicely captures the fact that perhaps, particularly with the state and the state action that we've seen in many countries around the world, muscles that were atrophying, you know, the fact that this period of neoliberal capitalism, of the hollowing out of the state and the movement away from a more interventionist state, that in the context of the COVID pandemic, we're relearning to exercise those muscles, and let's see, can they be used now in terms of addressing the larger and more looming and more devastating consequences of the planetary emergency. And here's some place-based action from the front lines from the Belfast Climate Commission. We had a report that came out there just before Christmas, where we're trying to map out a net zero carbon roadmap out to 2050. And this is the importance, and I'll come back to this in the conclusion, the importance of science-based targets, or evidence-based radicalism, if you like, in terms of using, you know, the best available climate and social science. And what we found in our study is that, and again, it's rather unusual for the profile of the city of Belfast, that most of our carbon footprint didn't come from the extraction and primary use of fossil fuels, for example. It came from the consumption end, and in particular in our domestic housing sector. And that's partly to do with the fact that we have really badly insulated houses, and also that we're very over-reliant on oil for space heating, which is, again, rather unusual for a city in Europe. And we're also very dependent upon the car. There are lots of other things we found, but just for reasons of time, they're the two headline. So they're the biggest footprints for ourselves as a city. And therefore, it would seem to be that a blind man on a galloping horse could see that, you know, policy recommendations on the back of these science-based analyses is the deep retrofit of our homes, particularly in domestic, but also commercial and public, and a modal shift away from ICE. ICE stands for internal combustion engine, and to move away from that major part of how we transport ourselves around our city. And these would deliver multiple co-benefits. You know, retrofit, reduce fuel poverty. Sadly, in Northern Ireland, we have 42% of households in fuel poverty. That means they're spending more than 10% of their income on trying to, keep their house at an ambient, comfortable temperature. In badly insulated houses, people are heating the street as opposed to heating themselves. And also we provide jobs with a deep retrofit. And as Matthew quite rightly pointed out, as we come out of this pandemic, we're going to need job creation initiatives. And here's just one. And I don't think this is unique for the city of Belfast. I think this could be transferred across other cities, across many European countries. And of course, as a Brucey bonus, if we engage in this deep retrofit, not only will we have these multiple co-benefits, including enhancing the local economic multiplier effect, because people often on low income tend to spend most of their money locally as opposed to it going outside their local economy and community. We'd also reduce greenhouse gas and particularly CO2 emissions. And of course, there are many multiple benefits from a modal shift away from the car particularly in terms of, improved connectivity, enhances, community building, and also better for people's health. And I do think we need to have an asset-based and indeed a jobs-focused recovery. And this picks up on some of the themes that both Kate and Matthew have talked about, to get beyond the usual business as usual language of growth, competitiveness, gross value added, and other metrics, which are largely a neoclassical in terms of the discipline of economics, or neoliberal in the context of the ideological space of the discussions of public policy in many countries. We need, in my view, well-paid jobs, unionized ideally and secure as we come out of this pandemic. And indeed, it's an issue, and it's wonderful to be on this call with so many of you here. While we may disagree in terms of particular policies, I do think those of us who are interested, whether it's Doughnut economics, whether it's the idea of a safe and just place for you, or space for humanity, community wealth building, cooperatives, moving beyond the orthodoxy, we need to have the courage of our convictions. And of course, the best way of demonstrating that is by sharing, such as we're doing here today. And I do hope this is the first of a number of initiatives of linking up people, because we have people here from, as far as I can see, from all over the world looking at this. So how can we build up that network of supporting one another as we each trying to figure a way in our place-based specificities, how we actually build back better as we come out of the pandemic. And the reality is there's no end to the work that is needed. So I think the idea of a job guarantee, I think is something that can also be considered. It may not be in the gift of a local council, it's more of a national level policy. And we do need to see how national and local as well as international can weave together. And I do think that we do need, whether you call it localization, relocalization, or selective deglobalization, not least because the pandemic has shown us the vulnerability of long supply chains, and particularly the critical importance to a nation or a community of food, of energy, in terms of, it makes a lot of sense to relocalize the provision of those basic, important commodities in the 21st century. So what I would say is what we need in terms of trying to bring together the Doughnut and the community wealth building model with the issue of the planetary crisis is a just transition. And this is coming out of the trade union movement in America, going back to the 1970s. And it's very much the idea that any transition to a more climate resilient, low carbon economy has to be ensured that there's no community that's left behind. But what does that look like in a local area? It will differ across the different jurisdictions that you're operating in. There's also the fundamental issue that if it is a planetary emergency and a climate crisis, let's act as if it is one. I'm just going to give you a selection there that many jurisdictions, parliaments, councils across the world have declared planetary and climate emergencies. Lancashire and a collection of 12 of Lancashire councils did this a few years ago. Here's just literally about 2 hours before I came on to this particular Zoom meeting, that we see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the indomitable Bernie Sanders demanding Joe Biden declare a climate emergency. The UK Parliament, in case you knew or didn't know, declared one back in May 2019. The Northern Ireland Assembly, where I am, declared one last year. And all of this is about, if you like, the XOR, the Extinction Rebellion moment of tell the truth about what's happening with the climate. And you may be interested in this, particularly for the academics on the call or interested citizens, that we have scientists who are now screaming, as scientists politely can do, i.e. in a peer-reviewed academic journal. And that's an issue. I do think there's an obligation on behalf of my own profession of intellectuals and academics who need to become a lot more engaged in the public. But here's an example of world scientists warning of a climate emergency. So many of us are living in jurisdictions where emergencies have been declared, but how would you know? How is our lives any different in the UK, or the Irish Parliament declared one, or Northern Ireland? Our lives haven't, changed in any way. The pandemic is what an emergency response looks like. And I think we need to, connect the lessons we're learning from that now with how we address the planetary crisis. And I do think, again, to reflect upon our own experience in the Place-Based Climate Action Network, which is a combination of cities, Belfast, Edinburgh, Leeds, together with the London School of Economics and the Grantham Institute there, of mapping out at local areas. And there's a number of now climate commissions that are emerging across the UK. So using science to try and map where is the biggest carbon hit, how can we match that with the maximum co-benefits that are cost effective. Some of the governance models that might, again, as ways of integrating discussions and policies and plans around donor economics inspired or community wealth building inspired initiatives could include citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries. We absolutely do need to move beyond the liberal representative system. And I speak as a recovering politician who was in the trenches of local government for 7 years. Again, I'd be interested in Matthew's response or other elected politicians here on the call. But my view is our systems of governance are broke. They are singularly incapable of dealing with the scale, the urgency, and capturing the opportunities of a transition beyond a carbon-based energy and competitive growth-based economy. I think we should explore new partnerships because the council's not going to be able to deliver it. Academics or the local anchor institution by itself are going to need alliances, and they look different in different areas. I do think there is a lot of merit in exploring climate commissions, such as the one that I'm a member of bringing together anchor institutions, stakeholder groups, engaging citizens, and so on. And I do think we need to really start moving beyond business as usual thinking, and which is, of course, what we're doing here today with the discussion of Kate's idea of donut economics, of a safe and just space for humanity, and also what Matthew's been telling us about in terms of community wealth building. But also we need to move beyond growth, in my view. GDP growth for its own sake is the ideology of the cancer cell. In many parts of the world, we are now in cancerous growth. Growth is needed in other parts of the world, but certainly in advanced, so-called advanced capitalist societies in Europe and North America, Australasia and Japan, we need to start talking about redistribution of the available wealth and job opportunities that we're going to need to engage in. I think also other issues that have been touched upon, like modern monetary theory, that I won't have time to go into it, but I encourage you all to have a look at this, that, for a sovereign currency issuing country like the UK or indeed America, you do not need austerity or indeed to raise taxes to pay for the transition. I think we also need to look at, retooling the finance sector to serve the real economy and to serve the just transition. That's why I'd certainly support, and we're trying to have an initiative here in Northern Ireland to set up a community bank. And in fact, one of the people involved in that, Tiziana O'Hara, is on that call. So maybe Tiziana might want to put something into the chat box. Or what about local currencies to keep the value and value creation within a local area? Or consider the UN SDGs as what local councils, what other industries, businesses, groups are orientated towards, as opposed to GDP growth. Or that most radical of organizations, the OECD, even they have begun to discern that we need to move beyond this myopic, singular focus on growth. It's a bit like driving a car. You don't just look at the speedometer.
2 minutes, John.
No problem, Mark. I'm nearly finished. You don't just drive a car by looking at the speedometer unless you're an idiot boy racer. You need to look at the engine, you need to look at the heating, temperature, and so on. In the same way, in managing a complex 21st century economy and society, we need a dashboard of indicators. For example, economic growth may be increasing, but it tells us absolutely nothing about its distribution. It tells us absolutely nothing about the mental health impacts of that frenetic the desire for growth and so on. So I think we need to have a much more sophisticated conversation locally as to what's the appropriate measures that people in Preston want to measure their progress by, and not just growth and competitiveness. So I think we need, it's an old green slogan, acting locally, thinking globally. The panic internally, I think, is probably a reflection of my own, anxiety at this current moment. But I do think we have to see that some just transition principles, which nicely dovetail with what both Kate and Matthew were saying. We need to socialize consumption, more libraries, more public transportation. We need to democratize production, including, I would say, the energy means of production. I do think we need to relocalize both production and consumption cycles without going into full autarky, but it's about the selective deglobalization. And absolutely, for anotherization, we need to decarbonize the local economy as quickly and as equitably and justly as we can. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough. We need to relentlessly focus on jobs, This is partly for democratic legitimacy. How are we going to get working class people to buy into a green transition? And let's be frank, and again, I might be unpopular for saying this, but I will, partly speaking from my own experience as a green politician. Too often the green agenda is seen as the purview of the educated, moderately affluent, guilty middle classes. We need to find a frame, a language that buys people in who don't come or share that particular sociological profile. And I think jobs are certainly a way that we can go to working class communities to support this transition. And we do need to move to a regenerative economy. And I think particularly there's lots of potential for job creation and the restoring of our degraded ecosystems in terms of a regenerative economic system. And a lovely phrase from Naomi Klein on this: we need to move from a dig and gig economy, an extractive, precarious-based economy, to a care and repair one. And if we do all that, maybe it's a big if, and if there's popular support for building back better and no going back, we might, just might, begin to see that it's now possible to imagine a world of beyond carbon fuel capitalism than the end of the world. None of this is given. Wonderful phrase here from James Baldwin. We have to face the uncomfortable truth of our completely unsustainable current economic system. We've no guarantee we'll succeed, but nevertheless, there it is. And I'll leave the last word to a fellow Irishman, George Bernard Shaw. So thank you for listening. So let's be unreasonable.
Thank you, John. That was great. And I think picks up a lot of the threads that Matthew and Kate had given us. So really opens up for a conversation between the three of you. And I'm just going to kickstart with a question from the chat to you specifically, John, before then leading into one for all three of you. So David from Edinburgh has said he's concerned that the climate commissions set up by or advocated by PCAN and other bodies remain talking shops in place of brave political leadership evidenced by Preston and other cities. Hey people, the climate and ecological emergency. And then moves on to say, if the governance system, including representative government, is broken, what do we do? So maybe you'd like to just say a little bit more about why you think that's a good way to go.
No, a great question. And I completely agree that climate commissions and other institutional innovations can end up being a bit like the Irish football team, you know, great on paper, crap on grass. Other teams are available. I mean, they're necessary, but radically insufficient. And they are a first step in beginning to at least bring, for me, the evidence base into policy making. You know, every commission or its equivalent should also have, as we're trying to do in Belfast, set up a citizens' assembly. You know, find new ways of engaging with citizens, because often the answers are in the room, the answers are in our communities. So certainly, you know, David is certainly correct that they can end up being talking shops. And of course, they are not decision-making bodies themselves. They're best seen as kind of think and do tanks that can inform those who are empowered to make decisions, elected politicians. But even on that issue, just to reiterate, I do think we need to radically refound our systems of democracy and democratic decision-making. What about, you know, citizens, juries, participatory budgeting, you know, much more democratizing, not just, as I mentioned in my presentation, democratizing production, but actually much more democratic ways of democratizing decision-making themselves.
Thank you. Can I just ask Kate and Matthew just to respond to that, just you know, fairly briefly, your views around representative democracy and because I think, Kate, you mentioned in your presentation about citizens, juries, citizens' assemblies as well.
Okay, I'll just jump in with a brief example. So my favorite example actually of this is from Japan. There's an organization called Future Design, led by Professor Saijo Joshi, and they hold, let's say it's like a citizens' assembly. They bring together a group of citizens in a town to reflect on their town, but then half of those people, they're given a ceremonial gown and they're said, you are a citizen here from 2060. And they go off and they deliberate and they take the long view. And when they come back, they just take so much a longer view and think bigger and are ready for far more radical policy measures now, because they know that action is already late. So of course, just get on with it, 2020. You know, we're in 2060 and we're looking back at you and thinking, but why did you take so long when you already knew? So I just love this because it's showing that the greatest technology we have is already here. It's the human imagination. And you can enable people to change the way they think just by putting on them a gown and inviting them to step into the future. So I would love to see this idea of future design practiced in many, many more citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy. It just shows that we're only just beginning to experiment with the design of deliberate democratic spaces that enables people to think in these ways that we know that the short-term cycle of 4-year elections is trapping those elected officials. So create other designs that enable people to think long in the way we already want to.
Thank you. And Matthew.
Yeah, just really briefly, I mean, very valid comments from both Kate and John. I think, you know, my inspiration often was in Brazil, where they had participatory budgeting. So what they do is they devolve council and other budgets down to the community, and they'd actually decide, you know, within reason, what those budgets were spent on. So I think more of that's what's needed. But again, I go back to the comment that I have. We're very centralised in the UK, and I think that's done purposefully to disempower communities. So you've got to find a way of getting around that. How we're going to do it, I don't know. Citizens' assemblies are brilliant, as is participatory budgeting, but we've really got to lobby for similar powers to European cities. In Berlin, they took a decision to municipalise the water supply. That's something I'd love to do in Preston. I won't legally be able to do it, or if I did, I'd probably have to be involved in a very prolonged court battle with the government over it, or United Utilities, for example. We're just not empowered to do these things. And also UBI, that's something we're going to apply for from the Secretary of State. Will they realistically give it us? You know, I'm not so confident myself, but we're going to try. You know, so we need to have that democracy and be given those tools to implement democracy at our own level, to be honest. Cheers.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna shamelessly ask a question of my own, which links to me leading this place-based climate action project, which, as all three speakers will know, one of the tasks of that is to explore how the Preston model and the Doughnut model might be brought together or overlaid and synergize in some way. So I want to ask questions to each three of you. Matthew, what are the ecological benefits of community wealth building? And what, if anything, do you think the Preston model can gain from engaging with Doughnut economics? Kate, what strengths do you feel the Preston model offers in starting to engage as a city with the Doughnut model? And John, as a PCAN investigator, what potential and value do you see from outside in a way for joining up or in some way integrating the two models? So maybe if we go in that order of Matthew, Kate, John.
Yeah, community wealth building. Interestingly, it came from the American Rust Belt, but it was to do with ownership of the economy, a lot of it, democratizing capital at source. So where it does differ, I think, from the Doughnut economic model, and please correct me, Kate, if I'm incorrect, is that I think the central thrust was around the ownership of the economy to some degree, who owns the stuff in local communities, right? So whereas a Doughnut economic model based around need and other things, primarily in the environment. But I think what we're seeing now is how there's very strong similarities between both, and how, you know, that to actually tackle the climate emergency, you've got to look at ownership of resources and distribution of resources. So Kate's presentation was excellent around these, you know, these examples of community banking, of credit unions, of municipal ownership. So the two seem to be very, very overlapped. You know, I'm not that interested in labels now. I'm really interested in delivering stuff on the ground, to be honest, because conferences like this are fantastic, but again, there's big challenges in Preston, and I need to get on with the job of actually implementing this on the ground, really. So we can learn a lot from each other, but as I said, what I'd like out of this is that more people actually form cooperatives, community energy schemes, lobby pension funds to divest, get involved to actually stand for council, maybe a parliament, to actually implement these ideas. I think out of it, I'd like to see a lot more of that, to be honest.
Great. Shall I jump in? So you asked me what can Doughnut economics learn from the Preston model, and it's everything. So the Doughnut is a set of goals, but as I said, the two dynamics that we believe fundamentally have to be transformed if we're going to meet those goals for the first time, because it's never been done before. The two dynamics that have to transform is moving from economic systems that are degenerative to becoming regenerative. So shorthand for that is a circular economy. And we need to move from divisive designs to distributive designs. Now, for me, if I think Doughnut Economics Preston work absolutely exemplifies everything about that distributive design. From local ownership to the ownership of the land and the cinemas, to the utilities, to setting up worker enterprises and co-ops, to local procurement, using all the different ways that the council is saying, what is it we can do to transform ownership to make it far more localized? So it's just a brilliant example of that in practice. And then I would say, well, and then there's the regenerative side. So how do you bring in, say, a far more circular economy? And actually that, again, it creates local jobs, retrofitting houses, reusing materials, reinventing the way we build. It brings in local jobs. And I know certainly in Amsterdam, where they've got quite strong regulation around circularity, I see an energy there unleashed. I see the architects, the construction companies, at first they say, oh, new regulation. And then they go, hang on, we can do this. And suddenly we're at the front curve of new design, and we're going to have skills that others are going to want. And we're actually designing, and they're young graduates coming in to the companies. They're like, wow, I actually get to use my skills. So I see it really, really closely fitting. And then I'll say that the power of inspiration is just huge. I've been talking over the last couple of months to a lot of different towns and cities that are interested, from Copenhagen to Tampere in Finland, yesterday to Utrecht in Brussels, giving talks to city councillors who just want to know a bit more what's going on. And they often say, okay, I like the theory, I like the idea, but what can we actually do in practice? And I say, well, here's Preston, right? This is a place that doesn't have any special advantage. It didn't have an amazing, in fact, it had, you could say it was hit with disadvantage. It lost a big investment that it thought was going to help its future. And it was actually that hit that opened up people saying, well, we're really going to have to invent something new here. Let's look to Cleveland, Ohio. Let's take that and then let's make it our own. And when I present the details of what's happening in Preston, I mean, I can see in councillors saying, oh, wow, hang on. Yeah, we have procurement. We can affect all those things. We're just not actually pulling on those possibilities. We've not seen them as tools, and people are very inspired by it. So to me, Doughnut Economics is only worth anything. It's a drawing of two circles on a page, right? It only comes to life when you can show that it's actually exemplified in practice in the economy. And so all of its value lies in it making sense. It helps make visible patterns that people are already creating. And in Preston, I see is one of the places that crucially showing we can move from divisive economics to distributive economics, like this and like this and like this and like this. And it makes a better place to live. So I see them very, very closely connected.
Thank you.
If I could come in, and I speak now not just as a lapsed but a completely collapsed Catholic, but the Bible does have some good lines, and one of them is, without vision the people perish. And for me, as an academic, as an activist, as Lynn mentioned, what does animate and concern me is, as a father, what I like about both Doughnut Economics and Community Wealth Building is how they frame complex ideas in very simple, understandable ways. And that's so, so important, particularly because the language that we use is really important to help people get behind it. I think the idea of a just transition, people, they may not know exactly what it is, but they like justice, we like fairness. And so for me, just as a practitioner in this space, and I speak an awful lot with politicians and citizens and fellow academics, there's a danger, though, in my own profession that we have this bizarre language that we hone and we are trained in. You would know this, Mark. And we need to unlearn, I think, some of those abstract ideas and find localized ways. So it's not just about like Doughnut Economics or community wealth building, but trying to find local idioms. That's what I like. For example, I did research many years ago on local currencies and the way in which if the local currency is given a local resonance, like I remember it was the bobbin, I think, in a part of Manchester and so on. And I think it's that place-based specificity that we really need to dig down in, and to see it's going to be from our local context, our capacity to protect our place without being, as I say, autarkic. That's where we're going to see, I think, great shifts, particularly at the city level, because I think cities are an under-acknowledged part of the climate transition story globally. And that's not discounting the importance of rural areas and so on. But again, it's that issue, I think, of the language. People can get it. And it's also very practical. It's going to deliver benefit for people. And that's what I see as a fantastic advantage of using and marrying. I don't know what the marriage might produce in terms of children, and we bring the Doughnut and community wealth building model. That's something for maybe somebody more imaginative than me can come up with in the chat.
Thank you. Can I come in? Because the chat has been absolutely explosively busy, as you can imagine, and with questions and comments, and Mags has been busily trying to harvest some themes from it. One of the themes that comes across very strongly is perhaps gathered together is on inequity, equality and diversity, not only income inequality, but inequality of resources between communities of different heritage and ability and so on. And Amber Thompson gathers it together. So I'm going to start by directing this to you, Kate. Should the inside of the Doughnut express equity across every indicator versus being compartmentalized? How do you address all people if you're not assessing marginalized people and ensuring equity across the board?
Top question, Amber. So yes, it absolutely should. So firstly, for the so the Doughnut, hang on a stick. So the inside of the Doughnut, these 12 dimensions, I took them directly from the Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason I did that was because that means that it's incontrovertible, because all the world's governments have already agreed that all the world's people have a claim to meeting this. No one can say, whose values are these? They're your values, they're not my values. So that's their power. The problem is they don't cover everything that we care about. And actually, it's just really interesting to think about. The Sustainable Development Goals came out of the Millennium Development Goals, and the Millennium Development Goals came out of the conferences of the 1990s at the UN, which came out of really the long history of human rights, which goes back to 1945. So these have got a human rights inheritance. And actually, human rights, I'm a big fan of human rights, but the texts that we have around human rights, they largely express individual rights. So most rights are about individuals having access to things they need. They don't talk, for example, about community. Do you have community? There's nothing actually in the UN conventions to say people have a right to community. And there's a very strong lean in the UN work, as I'm sure Amber knows, towards gender. And I think that's because the feminist movement has had a very strong lean in there and said, bring out gender issues. And so they've brought it in, and it's given its own little segment here, but there hasn't been the same lean on racial equality. And so it's missing. And to me, this is one of the galling things of like, you use the UN's work because it's got that international credibility, even though you know it's not complete and it's missing critical things. So two things. One, when we scaled down to the level of a city, we said, well, now we're not working with the SDGs because we're just doing it here. So actually, when we've done our downscaled Doughnut in Amsterdam, we brought in gender equality and racial equality and all kinds of inequalities between different identities so that they're all recognized. And we call it equality. We call it equality and diversity, and you'd want to look across. But the second point, the more important point that Amber directly makes is absolutely true, that you don't just put gender equality or racial equality in its own box. You want to measure it across all of these in education and in healthcare. That's what the whole national debate's been about. We've seen it in evidence, in access to food, in good energy, affordability of energy, and good housing. So yes, when you actually dive into this, and if you were to do a downscaled city Doughnut, you would absolutely dive into gender differences, racial differences, class differences, neighborhood differences of different identities, postcodes. If it's relevant where you are, you show that there are inequities that therefore need to be tackled. So Amber, you're bang on. Yes, you would absolutely want to dive into that.
I would just wonder, Matthew, would you also like to comment on that question from a much more localized perspective?
Yes, but the reality is with the pandemic, if you're rich, you've got more of a chance to, not in every case, but in most cases, you've got more of a chance of actually, bearing it well. If you're not so wealthy, you're disproportionately affected by it. I think lower income people have been 2.5 times affected by the pandemic. Also as well, if you have a minority community, again, you're disproportionately affected by COVID. And why is that? It's because of the inequalities that we've had. I mean, if you look at some of the frontline workers incur within the gig economy, retail, lower pay generally, they tend to be from a minority community. So again, this is something we've got to integrate into community wealth building, the Doughnut model as well. So, you know, within Preston, we're working with our community groups. So one of our first worker co-ops, it's self-employed taxi drivers. So they're seeing a threat from Uber coming into our community that will casualise and undermine the current standard of living. So they're organising in a worker co-op with support from the RMT, and they're mainly of a South Asian heritage. You know, so we want to get a lot more of that, to be honest, going forward. And the only way we can actually challenge these inequalities is by changing the economic system and making sure it's in the hands of more people instead of a small minority. And that is a question that politics hasn't really looked at until the last few years. In local government and even nationally, I'm back. I keep getting muted by accident. Yeah.
Yes, you're back.
I need to have a word with the IT people. We have a few challenges here at the City Council, I think. Yeah, so just 10 years ago, the question about who actually owns the local economy was not one that was actually really within political discourse. Now with Bernie Sanders and you know, Jeremy Corbyn and others, and even locally as well, that actually is a conversation that's taking place. And even it's more in the mainstream now with obviously Joe Biden and Keir Starmer as well, you know. The question around who actually owns resources of the economy needs to be answered, because that does disproportionately lead to the inequalities, which then affects minority groups, women, disabled, and ethnic minorities as well. Cheers.
John, I feel I should give you an opportunity as well, because you also are coming from a slightly different perspective, if you'd like to briefly respond to that.
Oh, I just want to agree with what both Matthew and Kate has said. I mean, particularly this moment that we're in now really is about a return of debates we've not really seen since the 60s and 70s about who owns the economy, how do we conceptualize the economy, what's the economy for? These basic fundamental questions, and it's a real materialism. So it's not just in terms of how, you know, I'm a bit of an Marxist myself at heart of a materialist view of history and so on, but it is about issues of class, of racial injustice, that we can't have climate justice without social and racial and gender justice. We want it all, and we shouldn't be, you know, pulling back in a way and trying to compromise on those fundamental issues. It's getting far, far too serious. I mean, I'm a generally happy, positive person myself, but I think I'm a carrier of depression because I read far too much climate science about what's emerging in the decades ahead. And what we should be doing, just to conclude, and again, it's perhaps another reason why I'm really enthusiastic about promoting and popularizing and supporting Doughnut economics and community wealth building, is that we need hope. Hope is one of the most vital things we need as we face the challenge ahead. But I would distinguish hope from optimism. Optimism is the happy thought that we'll have an app or we'll have some whiz-bang carbon capture and sequestration machine that will somehow solve these crises, or indeed that the government, local or national, will solve it. We're at a moment now where we need to be hopeful that action and agency is how hope is generated. So this really is literally a call for citizen action. I absolutely think that we're going to need a lot more non-violent direct action by citizens to demand this. Is because our current liberal democratic system within advanced capitalism is broken. And we simply need to, you know, to use that well-known trope from Monty Python, it's a dead parrot. Let's give it a decent wake, thank it for its services, and move on. That's what we should be doing in the context of the 21st century.
Thank you. I'm rather tempted to pose a question that Mark actually thought up, even though he's had a go, because it gathers together another thread within the chat. And I think I want to pose it first to the person at the sharp end, Matthew, because perhaps we know where Kate will stand on this. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. She can correct us, which is how you stand in relation to post-growth economics. Because you mentioned in particular, Matthew, you know, the role of pension funds And of course, as somebody in the chat pointed out, pension funds are very much tied to a model of growth economics. And it's hard to, it's quite hard to see how they would change and still meet their obligations. And of course, as a city councillor and leader, you're also positioned in, it seems to me, at the sharp end of those questions.
Yes, I mean, I'm very open to these discussions and debates, but we've got to work with what we have at the moment. Now, neoliberal culture, is that ingrained in people's minds, in institutions' minds, in politics, and has been for 40 years. So to actually bring that transformation to something better, you've got to start from a very low base and then hopefully speed it up and then embrace new ideas. So that's the way that I see it. I mean, you mentioned about the pension funds, the fact that there are conversations about divesting from fossil fuels and investing in things like renewable energy and affordable housing locally, potentially with support from councils. These are big steps forward that weren't taking place, these conversations, 10 or 20 years ago. So I just think you've got to move there bit by bit, to be honest. I'm very open to the idea that, we've got to prioritize distribution above economic growth, because if economic growth is done wrong, it exacerbates inequality, but also it causes damage to the environment. And it's the reckless pursuit of growth at all costs which is leading to the mess we're in at the moment. And it does very much link to the ownership of the economy, because the fact that so much of the economy is in the hands of so few people who want short-term profit, then that then leads to the environment being put under pressure as well. So I'm open to these ideas, but I think you've got to get the bit by bit. Thanks.
Kate, do you want to come back on that one?
Sure, not to come back, but I'll just add. So the language of growth and post-growth. So I like to, we can get trapped in the kind of growth and GDP thing. So I just like to say, GDP, thanks very much. You were very useful to some people in the 20th century. I just want to move you to the side, because the metrics that really matter now are that we create regenerative economies where we decarbonize and we dematerialize. So we're using resources again and again, and we're running on renewable energy. And I want to measure that. And what matters now is that we create economies where value that's created is shared far more equitably with all. So I want to look at the distribution. So those are the fundamentals. And particularly, if I come back to the donut, if we create economies that are showing they're clearly coming back within planetary boundaries, that to me is what matters. It's not what GDP is doing, right? So it's really important to be clear. We're not about, anyone who's really obsessed with the direction in which GDP must go. I would say, well, you're stuck in an economy in which we're structurally dependent upon endless growth, or you want to make it go down. No, the point is start measuring what really matters: generative economy, distributive economy. So that's where I think we need to be going to.
Kate, that also raises another thread in the chat, a minor one, but nevertheless an important one, about the importance of metrics and whether there are the right tools to measure, to assess processes of divestment and the kind of economy that you're talking about.
So just briefly on that, no, the metrics aren't there yet, right? So we're just beginning to invent the practices, and we're just beginning to realize the dynamics we want to create. And now it's time for the metrics to catch up. And that's why I'm so less interested in talking about GDP. Like, let's measure the things that we know we want. So again, coming back to the city of Amsterdam that I know quite well, where they are really going for having a circular economy, they're now putting in place what they call their circular monitor. So they're saying, well, we need new kinds of metrics. So what do we need to measure? We need to measure how many new resources we're using, what's the through flow, what's the reuse, what's the value that's created there. So they're beginning to put in place those new metrics. And I really like the point that John was making actually earlier. We need a dashboard of metrics. I couldn't agree more. And I believe, I like to imagine of parliaments, local and national, standing up in the future and actually reporting for their place, whether it's the UK as a whole or whether it's a town. This is how we've moved against these 21st century metrics. This is how over the past year our city has become more distributive, and Matthew was starting to show us some of that data. This is how over the past year we have reused more materials than we ever did before, and how we're becoming a circular economy. That is what we want to hear. This is how our communities are more connected, and there's more public space dedicated as community and public luxury than car parking. So I really want to see those metrics come through. They're not there yet. But that pointing out their gaps is the first step. And I really believe as we keep working on this, we'll look back in 10, 15 years time And we'll look back to here and say, wow, the metrics they were using were so crude. That donut thing with those red lines of overshoot, that was so crude. Yeah, it will be crude in the future, but we'll only get there if we start here. Like what Matthew's saying, let's start where we are, keep working on this. Some amazing data analysts working with 21st century data sets on input-output measures of the consumption of a nation, not just what's produced there, but the consumption. And we're beginning to be able to scale this to the level of a city. And we're beginning to actually be held responsible for the scale of our consumption. So I'm really excited that, you know, we're in the data revolution. Hallelujah. We're in the right century for data. So let's now focus that data on the dynamics that we actually want to bring about.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to?
I just wanted to actually bring John in there, because I think I'm right in saying that you have previously called yourself a degrowth economist. Is that right, John?
Well, we can get into the name game, as it were. I prefer post-growth, and I think it explains why I focus on jobs rather than, you know, if we get a bit of growth as a result of a jobs-oriented strategy, well and good. But I am absolutely convinced that the types of economies we're talking about that are going to be sustainable and regenerative have to be post-carbon, in my view, post-growth, and indeed post-capitalist. And they're difficult, provocative things to get your head around. And I'd just also like to put out there that I think we'll know we're in the right direction when we see an army general standing outside a shopping centre with a tin can looking for a few bob for his next tank. And when we see BBC News reports talking about the value of the gendered labour that currently goes unpaid and unrecognised in our homes and communities. That's the type of, you know, visualisation. I mean, and it's very hard to be what you can't see, as the phrase goes, to start trying to project. What are we thinking about in 2050 in terms of what's going on in the news, the reporting, the metrics? Because what gets measured gets done. And I think we can all agree, whether you call yourself post-growth, degrowth, or agnostic or whatever, that GDP served its purpose. It was good for fighting a war, for post-war reconstruction, but now we've moved beyond that. And it's that issue, it's the threshold. We've reached the threshold beyond which an obsession with GDP growth has now become counterproductive. In the same way that we shouldn't denigrate oil, coal, or gas. They were tremendously useful as resources. They helped build our industrial civilization. But again, we've now reached the threshold where they are now causing planetary and ecological crisis. And actually, we can technologically use those resources for much better things in terms of not burning them for fuel. And in fact, I think we should stop calling them fossil fuels and call them fossil resources as a way of reframing how we can use these useful materials.
Thank you. Okay, well, we've only got a few minutes left. As Lynn said, there is an absolute wealth of questions and comments in the chat. And what we'll endeavour to do, assuming it doesn't self-destruct instantly at the end of this, we will copy that and make sure that it's circulated along with the link to the recording. It's been a fantastic afternoon, I think, and it's one where when we set it up, 2 hours seemed quite long, but 2 hours now seems quite short, because it doesn't feel like we've kind of begun to scratch the surface in terms of moving into the kind of synergies that we've begun to talk about. So hopefully we can, you know, pick this up at a later date and have a follow-on event. So I'd like to thank everybody for being part of this and for participating in the chat, but I'd particularly like to thank Matthew, Kate, and John for your contributions. And I think the best way to end might be is ask the three speakers to actually do a closing statement, really, just letting us know the main things that you're taking away from this, and perhaps a key challenge for everybody going forward. Thank you. Okay, can I ask Matthew, Kate, and John, perhaps again in that order, just to give a closing statement, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark and Lynn, for putting this together. Lovely to meet you, Kate, and lovely to meet you, John. Really enjoyed the event. Lots of really good ideas, and I think we've got to look at how we can bring about solidarity between what we all believe in and what we're all trying to achieve going forward. I think it's quite a pivotal moment that we're having these conversations, but let's try to move to bring something practical on the ground. It's just really a plea. The solutions are out there to a much more prosperous community for us. I share the same view as John, that we need to gradually move beyond capitalism to a different system that's more democratic and equitable. But there are alternatives out there that do work. So we need to take this moment, I think, to actually implement those solutions on the ground, really. And that's what I'd like to take out from today, really, that, you know, there are successful regional economies where they have actually had those alternatives, like Mondragon, like Emilia Romagna in Italy, where they've got the cooperative economy which does predominate within those communities. And within that, you get you get higher wages, you get more jobs, you get lower levels of inequality, life expectancy is longer for people who work in those communities than communities where there's less cooperatives, and that's a prize that we have, really. And I think, you know, it's very challenging to actually put forward these alternatives, but they can be achieved with a bit of support. And I think we need to all work together, everyone in this call, to actually make sure that a more just and equitable local community and economy is forthcoming, really. So really thank you for today, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the contributions and speaking again, hopefully. Thanks.
Thanks,
Where did the
Matthew.
lithium come from? Where did the minerals come from?
And I'll jump in. Thank you so much. So I believe Sagar is asking a really critical question, which is, where does the lithium come from? Where do the minerals come from? And this is a really important point in people saying we need a renewable economy. And so the point is, what we cannot do is have everybody give up their petrol car and instead buy an electric vehicle. That's exactly what we can't do, because then you're just kicking off a whole new industrial chain of people getting lithium from lithium mines in Chile and Argentina. It's causing terrible poisoning and industrial pollution in communities there. This is exactly why we need to scale down our use of Earth's resources and come back within planetary boundaries. It's not just about carbon, it's across all issues. That's why the Doughnut includes carbon dioxide and all planetary boundaries. And that's why we need to create circular economies in which resources are used again and again and again. The good news of that is that many of the world's most powerful cities are now urban mines for minerals. And even some large companies are realizing that and mining what's already been extracted so it can be reused. It creates local jobs. It creates an ecosystem of resource reuse. So there is a lot of local enterprise in the future of the circular economy. So I feel optimistic about that. But thank you, Sagar, for raising that, because shifting to renewable energy, the energy may be clean, but the infrastructure is needed to raise it is not. And it's crucial that we look at that as well. So thank you for raising that. And I also want to say just thank you for this opportunity. As I said, the Doughnut is just a couple of concentric circles on the page. Unless, I think, as John said, we need, what did he say? He had this lovely quote of, we can only see things that are made visible. And I really believe that we need to make visible the new dynamics of the economy that is possible. So I'm 50 years old, so I grew up, the 1980s were when I started seeing how the world worked, and it was already divisive and it was already degenerative. So that's the only pattern I've ever known. And I believe most policymakers like me have only ever known that pattern. And what places like Preston are doing, and Cleveland and many, many others are showing, actually, you can redesign contracts, and we can redesign currencies and spendings and relationships and create totally different patterns. We can turn a divisive economy into a far more distributive one. And we can turn a degenerative economy into a regenerative one. And we can leave behind, personally, I just want to leave behind the isms of the 20th century, because I hear people get caught in such massive arguments about what they think capitalism is and socialism is. I even have right here, I have the black box of capitalism, because if you open it, then you just get in a raucous debate of what people think. So I'm just going to leave the isms in the last century, and let's talk about the new dynamics, and let's look at places like Preston that are bringing the new economy into practice and make that happen far more widespread. So thank you to everybody in Preston who's done the door-to-door knocking, talk to the people in procurement, done the really trudge work of changing contractual terms, because that's where the change actually happens. And it transforms dynamics. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And John.
Well, I think both Kate and Matthew have summed it up brilliantly. My own parting thoughts for you all is never underestimate the power of imagination. I think that's exactly what we need now. Creative solutions, co-created at local level. I have, great faith in people. And I think we've had so many decades, as Matthew said, of neoliberalism that we've almost forgotten. We've allowed these muscles of solidarity, of effective state action, of seeing that regulation can drive innovation. It's now about exercising those muscles once again, because we have no other choice. The market isn't going to save us. Technology is not going to save us, as the discussion around the rare earth metals needed, for example, for electric cars and renewable energy. But we do need to start engaging in these difficult conversations, but in a hopeful manner. Because again, it's about the intersection of multiple aspects of injustice. Where you find unsustainability, you'll always find injustice. That we cannot have a transition beyond, when you call it capitalism, or it's certainly our carbon energy system and an obsessively globalizing growth-based dynamic, which is completely unsustainable. We can only deliver on justice for those people in the global south. That's where development and growth and even carbon-based growth within the bubble is allowed. Otherwise, it comes across as the white privileged Western world talking to itself. We're engaging in these actions, just to finish, and in a similar way that many of us understand why we're working from home, wearing masks, washing our hands, is not necessarily to protect us, we're protecting other people. In the same way, whether it's donut economics, post-growth thinking, a dashboard of indicators, community wealth building, while they'll deliver benefits for our own citizens in our places where we live, they are also global gestures that are going to be absolutely necessary to enable the billion people on the planet who are living on less than $1 a day. We must never forget about that dimension of global justice, and it's the intersection of these that give me great hope. Every great transformation that we've seen in human societies was based upon hope and a sense of injustice. Votes for women, the abolition of slavery. For me, they are the types of historical inspiration that we should take cognizance of. It's not simply a policy reform that ain't going to cut it. We're talking about a much larger systematic change, which is exciting, and we should present, to finish off, our vision of the future like a postcard from a beautiful holiday place we want to go to. So not just dwell on the critique, but actually present the vision of the future that's practical and attractive for our citizens.
Thank you. Okay, well, thanks again enormously for your contributions, both the speakers and participants. And I'm sure this is going to be a conversation that carries on. So thank you.
Can I say a final word of apologies to those people, because so many people posted on the chat who feel that we haven't been able to represent their questions and their comments adequately. There were so many and so much interest that it really wasn't possible within the time frame. There was no intention to suppress anybody's voice. We will think hard about a sequel to this and how we can carry on the conversation. So please watch this space. And I hope that you've posted those comments on the chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Slán Abhaile. Take care.
See you all. Cheers.